As the car rumbled through the dense New Hampshire woods, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the uneven asphalt filled the silence between us. I had grown accustomed to these quiet stretches of contemplation whenever Elliot drove. He gripped the wheel with a steady hand, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the road ahead, the golden hue of the late afternoon sunlight casting sharp shadows across his angular face. His silence wasn't unsettling. It was the silence of a man calculating, processing, already piecing together the puzzle before we even reached our destination. I, on the other hand, was fighting a quiet battle with my nerves. The further we traveled, the denser the forest became, its towering pines and skeletal birches enclosing us in a canopy of gloom. There was something about the air thick and cool, carrying with it a faint metallic tang, that set me on edge. It was the kind of air that whispered secrets if you listened too closely. "Clearwater Asylum," I murmured, breaking the silence as I glanced at the yellowed map spread across my lap. The faded ink listed a series of outdated roads and forgotten landmarks. But there it was, scribbled in ominous letters near the map's edge. "Elliot, you really think this place holds the answers?" Elliot didn't immediately respond. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, his thumb brushing against the cracked leather. "It's the one lead we have, Miguel," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with purpose. "Jeremy Wainwright wasn't just drawn to this place by chance. Something led him there, something he thought was worth risking his life to uncover." I frowned, the weight of the words pressing down on me. Jeremy Wainwright, a young man with everything to lose, had walked into Clearwater Asylum 2 weeks ago. Hours later, he was dead, leaving behind a grieving family and a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Hired by the Wainwrights to get to the truth, Elliot had taken the case without hesitation. And, as always, I had found myself pulled into his orbit, my curiosity too strong to resist. The car crested a hill and the asylum came into view. My breath caught in my throat. The building stood as a monument to decay and despair, its crumbling facade looming over the treetops like a grotesque relic of a forgotten time. Vines snaked up its weathered walls, their gnarled tendrils clawing at the broken windows. The roof sagged in places, its shingles missing like rotted teeth. Above the arched entrance, a faded sign still bore the words Clearwater Asylum, though time and neglect had rendered them almost illegible. Elliot parked the car near the rusted gates, the screech of the brakes breaking the oppressive quiet. For a moment, neither of us moved. We simply stared at the building, its shadow stretching across the overgrown driveway like a creeping hand. "Charming?" I muttered, trying to lighten the mood, though my voice carried none of the humor I intended. Elliot glanced at me, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're free to wait in the car, Miguel," he said, though we both knew I wouldn't. He opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing through the still air. With a sigh, I followed suit, the cold seeping through the soles of my shoes as I stepped onto the damp, moss-covered ground. The chill bit at my skin, despite the fact that it was only early autumn. The gates swung open with an eerie groan as Elliot pushed them aside. "It's just a building," he said, more to himself than to me. "Buildings can't hurt you." "No," I replied under my breath, "but whatever's inside might." The main doors were slightly ajar, as if inviting us to step into the darkness beyond. The heavy wooden slabs were scarred with deep gouges, their brass handles tarnished and cold to the touch. As we stepped inside, the stale air hit me like a physical force, thick and suffocating, carrying with it the scent of mildew and rot. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that filtered through the cracked windows, illuminating the desolation within. The lobby was a ghost of its former self. Once a place of order and welcome, it now resembled the aftermath of some terrible disaster. The tiled floor was cracked and uneven, littered with debris, shards of glass, splintered wood, and the remnants of forgotten lives. A broken wheelchair lay overturned near the reception desk, its wheels frozen in a silent scream. Elliot crouched near a pile of scattered papers, his gloved fingers brushing against the faded ink. Patient records, he noted, holding up a file with jagged edges. Mostly illegible, but someone's been here recently. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. How can you tell? He pointed to a footprint in the dust, a crisp, undeniable impression leading toward the hallway on the right. It was small, likely Jeremy's, and fresh enough to suggest he hadn't been alone. "Stay close," Elliot said, rising to his feet and motioning for me to follow. The hallway stretched before us like the gaping maw of some unholy beast. The further we ventured, the darker it became, the flickering light of our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. The walls were lined with faded murals, scenes of serene countryside landscapes, their vibrant colors long since drained by time. The contrast between the pastoral imagery and the oppressive atmosphere sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of our footsteps. Elliot paused, tilting his head. At first, there was nothing but the creak of the floorboards and the distant rustle of leaves outside. But then it came, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the wind through the cracks in the walls. I swallowed hard. "It's probably just the wind," I said, though the words felt hollow. Elliot didn't reply. Instead, he pressed forward, his movements deliberate and unyielding. I admired his composure, though I couldn't help but wonder if he ever truly felt fear, or if his determination simply outweighed it. We reached a set of double doors at the end of the hallway. They were marked with a faded sign that read "Treatment Ward." The hinges protested loudly as Elliot pushed them open, revealing a cavernous room filled with rusted beds and toppled for stands. The shadows here seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and writhing in the corners of my vision. Elliot's flashlight caught something glinting on one of the beds, a small, leather-bound notebook. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Jeremy's journal," he said softly, his voice tinged with both relief and unease. Before I could respond, the air grew colder, the temperature plummeting so suddenly that my breath came out in visible puffs. The whispers returned, louder now, their disjointed words echoing off the walls. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering like a dying heartbeat. "Elliot," I began, but my words were cut off as the room erupted into chaos. Beds screeched across the floor, their metal frames grinding against the tiles. The shadows coalesced into a vaguely human shape, its hollow eyes burning with an otherworldly light. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Elliot, however, stood his ground. "We're not leaving," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the cacophony like a blade. "Not until we get answers." And as the shadow lunged toward us, I realized there was no turning back. The air was electric, a charge that prickled my skin and made every hair on my body stand at attention. My breath came fast, sharp puffs of white vapor as the room plunged into freezing cold. Shadows that had previously lingered at the edges of my vision now moved with purpose, drawn together like droplets of ink bleeding through water. My flashlight faltered again, flickering with an almost frantic urgency. Elliot stood firm, his jaw tight, his flashlight beam unwavering. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, a relentless drumbeat of fear. "We need to move," I managed, my voice cracking under the weight of dread. My words sounded foreign, small and brittle in the vast, oppressive silence. Elliot, of course, was unfazed. "Not yet," he said calmly, his eyes fixed on the center of the room where the shadowy mass writhed. It was almost human in shape, though its edges were blurred, as if reality couldn't fully contain it. Its hollow eyes, pits of unrelenting darkness, seemed to fix on us, on him specifically. I wanted to pull him back, to drag him out of this godforsaken place, but my limbs wouldn't respond. Fear rooted me to the spot, paralyzing and complete. The only motion I could manage was a shuddering gasp as the shadow lunged. Elliot moved faster than I thought possible, grabbing me by the collar and yanking us both toward the door. The force broke the trance that held me, and my feet finally obeyed, carrying me forward in unsteady strides. The room exploded into chaos behind us. A cacophony of screeching metal and splintering would as the abandoned beds were thrown violently across the room. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The shadow wasn't following. It didn't need to. It was growing, spreading, filling the air like smoke. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, striking the walls and floor, leaving scorch marks where they touched. Elliot slammed the doors shut behind us, his movements calm and precise despite the tremor in my hands. His flashlight beam swept over my face, briefly illuminating what I could only imagine was the panic etched into my features. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice level but tinged with concern. "Do I look all right?" I shot back, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I leaned against the wall, its cold surface grounding me in the moment. "What the hell was that?" "That," Elliot said, his tone clipped, "is why we're here." The hallway felt even darker now, the flickering lights casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls. The temperature hadn't risen, and I clutched my jacket tighter around me, though it did little to stave off the cold. Elliot moved ahead, his strides purposeful, while I followed reluctantly, every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sending my nerves into overdrive. We stopped at a corner where the hallway split in two directions. Elliot pulled Jeremy's notebook from his pocket, flipping through its pages with practiced efficiency. The yellowed paper crinkled under his fingers, the handwriting jagged and frantic, as if Jeremy had scrawled his notes in a hurry. "This way," Elliot said, tucking the notebook back into his coat as he turned down the left corridor. "Wait a minute," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "You're not seriously thinking of going deeper, are you? Did you not see what just happened back there?" "I did," he said simply, shaking off my grip, "which is why we need to keep going." I stared at him, incredulous. "Elliot, that thing, whatever it was, wasn't natural. We're dealing with something way out of our league here." He turned to face me, his expression softening just enough to make his determination bearable. "Miguel, we've dealt with unnatural things before. This isn't new. What is new is that we're closer to the truth than we've ever been. Jeremy came here looking for answers, and now we're standing on the threshold of finding them. You can walk away if you want, but I have to see this through." His words were a challenge, but not one born of malice. I hated how right he was. Against my better judgment, I nodded and followed him into the dark. The corridor led to a stairwell, its steps spiraling downward into the heart of the asylum. The walls here were lined with old, rusted pipes that groaned under the strain of years, their joints dripping with condensation that pooled in stagnant puddles below. The air grew heavier with each step we descended, the weight of the building pressing down on us as if the asylum itself resented our intrusion. We reached the bottom, emerging into a vast, open space that could only be described as the asylum's bowels. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven, and the walls were bare except for the occasional smear of something I didn't want to think too hard about. In the center of the room stood a single, rusted chair surrounded by a ring of faintly glowing symbols carved into the floor. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "A ritual chamber," Elliot replied, stepping cautiously toward the center. "Or what's left of one." The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen, their jagged lines and harsh angles forming a pattern that seemed almost alive. They pulsed faintly, as if reacting to our presence, and I could feel the energy radiating from them. A low, humming vibration that set my teeth on edge. Elliot crouched beside the chair, examining the symbols closely. These weren't done in haste. Whoever carved them knew exactly what they were doing. Dr. Ainsworth? I guessed, my gaze darting nervously around the room. "Most likely," Elliot said, his tone thoughtful. He reached into his coat and pulled out Jeremy's notebook again, flipping through the pages until he found a sketch of the same symbols. Jeremy was here. He saw this. My stomach churned at the thought. "You think this is what killed him?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. His focus was on the chair, his flashlight illuminating the dark stains that marred its surface. "Not directly, but it's connected. This room. This is where it all started." "Where what started?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Elliot stood, his expression grim. Whatever Ainsworth was trying to achieve, this was his ground zero. And if the energy in this room is any indication, he may have succeeded. A sudden noise, sharp and metallic, cut through the silence, freezing us both in place. It echoed from the far corner of the chamber, where the shadows seemed deepest. Elliot raised a hand, signaling for me to stay quiet as he moved toward the sound. I followed reluctantly, my every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. As we approached, the shadows parted just enough to reveal what lay within. A door. It was old, its metal surface corroded and pitted with rust, but it stood out starkly against the concrete wall. Faint scratches marred its surface, as if someone or something had tried desperately to claw their way in or out. The handle was cold under Elliot's touch as he turned it, the hinges groaning in protest as the door swung open. Beyond was darkness, true, impenetrable darkness that our flashlights barely seemed to penetrate. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Elliot stepped forward, his movements steady and deliberate, and I followed close behind, my hand brushing against the cold, damp wall for support. The passage sloped downward, the floor slick with moisture, and I struggled to keep my footing as we descended further into the unknown. The air grew colder still, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent now, their disjointed words echoing in my ears. My flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering weakly before going out entirely. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to fix it, but before I could, Elliot's voice broke through the darkness. "Miguel," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "Look." I turned my head, my eyes struggling to adjust to the faint light that seeped through cracks in the walls. And then I saw it, A figure standing at the end of the passage, its outline faint but unmistakable. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. What is that?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "I don't know," Elliot admitted, his voice steady despite the tension in his jaw. "But we're going to find out." The silence was suffocating, heavy with the weight of the unknown. I could still feel the chill from earlier clinging to my skin, as though the darkness of that figure had imprinted itself on me. It wasn't just a cold you could shake off by rubbing your arms or blowing into your hands. It reached somewhere deeper, somewhere bone deep. I stayed behind Elliot, his flashlight casting harsh, fleeting beams onto the uneven ground as we pushed forward into the passage. "Elliot," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the oppressive darkness. "What did we just see back there?" He didn't answer immediately. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, on the subtle grooves in the walls, on every crack and mark as if they were words in a language only he understood. Finally, he murmured, "Something tied to this place. Something that doesn't want us here." The thought sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I bit back the rising fear in my chest and pressed forward. The walls around us grew damper the deeper we ventured. Drops of moisture clung to the jagged surfaces like beads of sweat, and the air thickened with an earthy, almost metallic scent. My flashlight flickered once again, but I smacked the side of it in frustration, forcing it back to life. The limited beam cast long shadows that danced across the walls in mockery of my unease. "What kind of man builds a place like this?" I muttered more to myself than to Elliot. The thought of Dr. Richard Ainsworth made my skin crawl. A man who blurred the lines between science and the occult, driven by a need to transcend death itself. How desperate or mad did you have to be to step onto that path? Elliot's voice cut through my musings. Someone who thought they were above consequence. Someone who believed they could bend the laws of nature to their will. The passage opened into another chamber. It wasn't large, just a tight, oppressive room with a low ceiling and walls streaked with grime. Rusted chains hung limply from hooks embedded in the stone, and beneath them, the floor was marred with deep gouges and scratches. A makeshift table stood in the corner, piled with what looked like scraps of paper and broken glass jars. I hesitated at the threshold, but Elliot stepped inside without pause, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the room like a surgeon's scalpel. "Search for anything that doesn't belong," he instructed, his tone clipped and professional. I wasn't entirely sure what qualified as belonging in a place like this, but I moved to the table, carefully sifting through the clutter. Most of the papers were indecipherable, the ink smudged beyond recognition or the text written in what appeared to be a series of cryptic symbols. I picked up one particularly strange sheet, its edges curled with age. The lines reminded me of the carvings we'd seen earlier, jagged and angular with a deliberate symmetry that made my head hurt if I looked too long. "Elliot, take a look at this," I said, holding up the paper. He glanced at it briefly before pocketing it. "Another clue," he said simply. "Anything else?" I shook my head, but then something caught my eye, a faint glint of metal poking out from beneath a pile of broken glass. Carefully, I reached for it, brushing aside the shards to reveal a small, intricately designed key. It was heavy in my hand, its surface etched with the same symbols as the ones on the paper and on the floor of the ritual chamber above. "I found something," I called, holding the key out for Elliot to see. He approached, taking it from me and examining it closely. "Ainsworth's crest," he muttered, tracing the patterns with his finger. His lips pressed into a thin line. This opens something. Something important. At his words, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers I'd hoped were just a trick of my imagination returned. Louder this time. They were incomprehensible but insistent, as though the very walls were trying to speak to us or warn us. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound composed. "Whatever's here, it's not happy we're intruding." Elliot didn't argue, which was a rarity in itself. He slipped the key into his pocket and motioned for us to leave. As we retraced our steps back into the passage, the whispers seemed to follow, growing fainter but never truly fading away. We emerged back into the corridor, and I felt an odd sense of relief at the sight of the cracked, graffiti-covered walls. It was strange to think of the upper levels of the asylum as safe, but compared to the suffocating darkness below, they might as well have been a warm, inviting home. "What do you think the key unlocks?" I asked as we made our way toward the stairwell. Elliot's expression was unreadable. Something Ainsworth didn't want anyone to find. That wasn't exactly comforting, but it wasn't unexpected either. Nothing about this place suggested it had been built with good intentions. The deeper we delved, the more it felt like we were unraveling a tapestry of malice and insanity, each thread darker and more twisted than the last. As we ascended the stairs, a faint noise reached my ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. I froze mid-step, straining to pinpoint the source. "Elliot," I whispered, gesturing for him to stop. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon concealed beneath his coat. The tapping grew louder, more erratic, echoing through the stairwell with an almost frantic energy. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't coming from above or below. It was coming from the walls themselves. And then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. My ears strained for any hint of movement, but there was nothing, only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my pulse. "Let's keep moving," Elliot said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. I didn't argue. The sooner we left the stairwell, the better. The hallway we entered next was lined with doors, each one slightly ajar and revealing glimpses of what lay beyond. Empty patient rooms, their beds overturned and their walls scrawled with graffiti. Offices filled with broken furniture and shredded paperwork. Storage closets brimming with forgotten relics of the asylum's past. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the dim light barely illuminated the path ahead. Elliot paused at one of the doors, pushing it open with the tip of his flashlight. "This looks different," he said, stepping inside. I followed hesitantly, my stomach twisting as the room's contents came into view. Unlike the others, this room was pristine, or as pristine as a room in an abandoned asylum could be. The walls were free of graffiti, the floor swept clean, and the furniture arranged with meticulous care. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing a small table that held a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Elliot approached the table, his fingers brushing over the recorder's surface. "It's operational," he noted, flipping a switch. The machine whirred to life, its reels spinning as static crackled from the speakers. And then, a voice, low and gravelly. It spoke in measured tones, each word deliberate and chilling in its intensity. To transcend the boundaries of mortality, one must first accept the fragility of the human condition. Pain is but a vessel, fear a key, and with the right tools, even death can be conquered. The voice sent a chill down my spine, and I had no doubt who it belonged to: Dr. Richard Ainsworth. The recording continued, detailing procedures and rituals that sounded more like acts of torture than medical treatment. My stomach churned as Ainsworth described his patients as volunteers, their suffering a necessary step in his pursuit of immortality. Elliot stopped the tape abruptly, his face pale but composed. "This is it," he said. "This is the proof we need." "Proof of what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That Ainsworth didn't just experiment on the mind. He was trying to break the very fabric of life itself. The room felt colder, the walls closing in as the weight of Ainsworth's words settled over us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the shadows in the corners weren't just shadows. "We need to keep going," Elliot said, his tone resolute. "There's more to this than what he's told us." I nodded, though every instinct screamed for me to leave. Whatever Ainsworth had done here, it was far from over, and we were standing in the heart of it. The first sound was a crack, brittle and sharp, splitting the still air. I froze mid-step, my heartbeat reverberating in my ears as I scanned the hallway around us. The shadows seemed heavier here, more oppressive, thick as smoke and twice as suffocating. My breathing was uneven, each inhalation carrying a slight tremor of unease. Elliot was already moving, his flashlight sweeping methodically across the damp walls, and his body angled slightly forward with his trademark intensity. His silhouette, tall and unyielding against the dim light, might have looked heroic under different circumstances. Here he just looked reckless. "Elliot," I called, my voice a low hiss. "Tell me you heard that." He stopped, looking back at me with an expression that was equal parts irritation and patience. "Of course I heard it," he said in his flat, matter-of-fact tone. "And we're about to find out what caused it." Naturally, that was his response. It was always his response. I wanted to argue, to tell him this was different. This place wasn't like the others. Every brick, every rusted nail seemed steeped in a history too dark and too heavy to bear. But I knew better than to try reasoning with Elliot when he was in this state. Once he had a lead, he wouldn't let it go. Not until he had chased it to its conclusion, no matter how dangerous or foolish. Reluctantly, I followed him, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. We reached a set of double doors at the end of the hallway. Their once pristine wood now warped and splintered from years of neglect. The faint outline of letters above the doorframe suggested this had once been the administrative office, though time and decay had rendered the words illegible. Elliot pressed his ear to the door, his head tilting slightly as he listened. The silence stretched, heavy and taut, before he nodded once and pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, far larger than I had expected, with high ceilings that disappeared into shadows. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers hanging open at odd angles like the yawning mouths of forgotten corpses. Papers were scattered across the floor, their edges yellowed and curling with age. In the center of the room stood a massive desk, its surface cluttered with broken pens, empty inkwells, and what looked like the remnants of a typewriter. But what caught my attention, what seized it in an icy grip and refused to let go, was the figure hunched over the desk. It was humanoid in shape, though the edges of its body blurred and wavered as if viewed through heat waves. Its head jerked up at the sound of the door creaking open, and the thing turned toward us with a movement that was too fast, too unnatural. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling mass of shadows, impossible to focus on and yet impossible to ignore. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling from my hand and clattering to the ground. The beam flickered wildly, casting erratic patterns of light across the walls and the creature. I heard Elliot mutter a curse under his breath, his usually steady voice tinged with unease. The creature didn't move closer. It didn't need to. The weight of its presence was enough to paralyze me where I stood, a cold knot of dread coiling in my stomach. Then, without warning, it dissipated. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, leaving behind nothing but the faintest hint of sulfur in the air. What was that? I managed to choke out, my voice hoarse and trembling. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He crouched to pick up my flashlight, handing it back to me without a word. His eyes were distant, his mind clearly working through whatever new puzzle the creature had presented. "We're close," he said finally, his voice low and resolute. "Whatever's behind all this, it's trying to stop us. That means we're on the right track." I wanted to laugh, to shout, to tell him how absurd that logic was. But I didn't. Instead, I followed him further into the room, my feet dragging slightly with every reluctant step. The desk itself was a mess, its drawers broken and spilling their contents onto the floor. Elliot rummaged through them with the precision of a surgeon, his fingers deftly sorting through papers and trinkets with practiced ease. I wandered to the edges of the room, my flashlight sweeping over the filing cabinets in the hopes of finding something useful. What I found instead was a photograph. It was tucked inside a cracked leather folder, its edges frayed and its colors faded. The image was of a man I didn't recognize, standing in front of what I assumed was Clearwater Asylum. His expression was solemn, almost grim, and his eyes seemed to follow me no matter which angle I held the photo. "Elliot," I called, holding the photo up for him to see. "Look at this." He took it from me, studying it intently before slipping it into his pocket. "Ainsworth," he said simply, as if the name explained everything. "Are you sure?" He nodded, his gaze lingering on the photo for a moment longer before returning to the desk. "Everything here points back to him. His experiments, his obsession with immortality. Whatever he started, it hasn't ended." The room felt colder, darker, as though the very mention of Ainsworth's name had drawn some unseen presence closer. I shivered, my grip tightening around my flashlight. "Elliot," I said carefully, "what if it's not just us in here? What if he's still alive?" Elliot finished for me, his tone unreadable. "He isn't, but that doesn't mean he's gone. We found the second key tucked inside the desk, its surface identical to the one we had discovered earlier." Elliot pocketed it without hesitation, his movements brisk and purposeful as he turned to leave the room. "Where to now?" I asked, falling into step behind him. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled Jeremy's notebook from his coat and flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. Finally, he stopped at a page near the back, his finger tracing a sketch of what appeared to be a circular lock. "This," he said, holding the notebook up for me to see, "this is what we need the keys for." I studied the sketch, the intricate patterns surrounding the lock sending a familiar chill down my spine. "And where do we find it?" Elliot's gaze flicked to the door, his expression hardening. "The basement." The journey back to the stairwell was uneventful, though the silence felt heavier now, as if the asylum itself were holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls, seemed amplified, each sound a reminder of the malevolent presence lurking just out of sight. When we reached the stairwell, Elliot led the way down, his flashlight cutting through the darkness with unwavering precision. I followed close behind, my nerves taut as a bowstring with every step we descended. The basement was even darker than I remembered, the oppressive gloom pressing in from all sides like a living thing. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, their disjointed words echoing off the walls. "Keep moving," Elliot said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. We reached the end of the passage, where a circular door stood embedded in the wall. Its surface was engraved with the same symbols we had seen throughout the asylum, their jagged lines pulsing faintly as though alive. Elliot pulled the keys from his pocket, his movements deliberate as he inserted them into the twin locks on either side of the door. The mechanisms clicked into place, and the door groaned as it swung open, revealing a darkness even deeper than the one we had left behind. For a moment, neither of us moved. We simply stood there, staring into the abyss, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavily on our shoulders. "Ready?" Elliot asked, his voice low. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway, and we stepped into the unknown. The air on the other side of the circular door was heavier, as if crossing its threshold had brought us into a realm where the rules of nature no longer applied. My skin prickled with an unnatural chill, and the faint hum of the asylum seemed to grow louder, reverberating in my chest like a drumbeat. The darkness ahead was almost alive, thick, consuming, and impenetrable. Even the beams of our flashlights struggled to pierce it, their light swallowed by the void. Elliot stepped forward with the kind of confidence that seemed reckless to anyone who didn't know him. He held his flashlight low, his other hand resting lightly on the hilt of the knife hidden beneath his coat. There was a certain grace to his movements, a predator-like precision that spoke of years spent walking the fine line between danger and survival. I envied that about him. My footsteps, on the other hand, were clumsy and hesitant, each one echoing too loudly in the oppressive silence. The passage sloped downward, the walls narrowing as we descended deeper into the bowels of the asylum. Every now and then, my flashlight caught glimpses of strange markings etched into the stone, symbols that mirrored the ones we had seen above but were far more intricate, more deliberate. They seemed to pulse faintly, as though charged with some unseen energy. "Do you think Ainsworth carved these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Speaking at full volume felt wrong, like it would awaken something better left undisturbed. "Maybe," Elliot replied without turning. "Or maybe they've been here longer than he has. Either way, they're significant." Significant. The word lingered in the stale air, carrying with it an ominous weight that made my stomach churn. I didn't press him further. Elliot rarely spoke in absolutes unless he was certain, and the fact that even he was unsure unnerved me more than I cared to admit. The whispers returned as we pressed on, faint and disjointed at first but growing steadily louder. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, their fragmented words curling around us like tendrils. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone was unmistakable. Accusatory, pleading, and angry all at once. I clenched my fists, willing myself to focus on the ground beneath my feet, but it did little to quell the rising tide of unease. "Elliot," I murmured, my voice trembling despite my efforts to steady it. "Do you hear?" "I hear them." He cut me off, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Ignore them. They can't hurt you." I wanted to believe him, but the tremor in my hands betrayed my doubt. The whispers weren't just sounds. They were a presence, oppressive and suffocating, like invisible fingers pressing against my throat. I could feel them crawling beneath my skin, probing the edges of my sanity. And then, just as abruptly as they had begun, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that pressed against my ears and made my head throb. It was almost worse than the whispers, this absence of sound, as if the asylum itself was holding its breath. Elliot came to a sudden stop ahead of me, his flashlight fixed on a wide, arched doorway carved into the stone. It was flanked by two grotesque statues, their features twisted into expressions of agony and rage. Their eyes, cold, unseeing hollows, seemed to follow us as we approached. "Charming decor," I muttered, my attempt at humor falling flat even to my own ears. Elliot didn't respond. He was focused on the door, his sharp eyes scanning the carvings that adorned its surface. They depicted scenes of suffering and torment, figures writhing in chains, faces contorted in silent screams. At the center of it all was a symbol we had seen countless times before, Ainsworth's crest. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice low but certain. "Whatever Ainsworth was hiding, it's behind this door." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. "And you're sure we want to open it?" Elliot glanced back at me, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Scared, terrified," I admitted. "But I'm still here, aren't I?" His smirk widened ever so slightly, and for a brief moment, the tension between us eased. Then he turned back to the door, his expression hardening once more. He retrieved the keys from his pocket, their metallic surface glinting faintly in the light. The locks clicked into place with an ominous finality, and the door groaned as it swung open. A rush of cold air spilled out, carrying with it a scent that made my stomach churn. Damp earth, decaying wood, and something metallic, like old blood. The room beyond was vast, its size exaggerated by the oppressive darkness that swallowed the edges of the space. Pillars of stone rose from the floor like skeletal fingers, their surfaces covered in the same pulsating symbols that lined the passage. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface slick with a dark, viscous substance that gleamed in the faint light of our flashlights. Elliot moved toward the altar with measured steps, his flashlight sweeping over the ground. I followed reluctantly, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. The air here was different, thicker, almost tangible, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. As we drew closer, I noticed something resting on the altar. It was a book, its leather cover cracked with age and its edges blackened as if singed by fire. Strange symbols adorned its surface, their patterns hypnotic and disorienting. Elliot reached for the book, his movements deliberate. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, the room seemed to shudder, the ground beneath us vibrating with a low, guttural hum. "Elliot," I said, my voice rising with panic. "What's happening?" Before he could answer, the symbols on the pillars flared to life, their pulsating glow intensifying until the room was bathed in a sickly, otherworldly light. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, their fragmented words forming a chaotic symphony that echoed off the walls. And then the shadows came. They poured from the corners of the room, dark and formless, moving with a speed and precision that defied logic. They swirled around us, their movements erratic and predatory. My flashlight flickered violently before going out completely, leaving us at the mercy of the pulsing light from the symbols. Elliot stood his ground, the book clutched tightly in his hands. "Miguel," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Stay close." I didn't need to be told twice. I pressed myself against his back, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the knife tucked into my jacket. It felt pitifully inadequate against whatever forces we were facing, but it was better than nothing. The shadows circled us, their forms shifting and coalescing into something almost humanoid. Their faces were twisted masks of anguish, their eyes hollow and unseeing. One of them lunged, its movements a blur, but Elliot was faster. He swung the flashlight like a club, the beam cutting through the shadow and sending it recoiling with an unearthly screech. "They don't like the light," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "Keep your flashlight on. It's dead," I shouted, smacking the useless device against my palm in frustration. Elliot cursed under his breath, his eyes darting around the room as the shadows regrouped. He reached into his coat and pulled out a second flashlight, tossing it to me without hesitation. "Here, use this." I barely caught it, my fingers fumbling with the switch. The light flared to life, and I swung the beam toward the nearest shadow. It recoiled instantly, its anguished screech echoing through the chamber. The next few moments were a blur of chaos and adrenaline. The shadows came at us in waves, each assault more frenzied than the last. But each time, the light drove them back, their forms dissipating like smoke before a gust of wind. Finally, the assault ceased. The shadows retreated to the edges of the room, their forms melting into the darkness. The whispers faded, leaving behind an eerie, oppressive silence. Elliot exhaled slowly, his grip on the book tightening. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. Together, we moved toward the exit, the weight of the book and the oppressive gaze of the unseen forces pressing down on us with every step. But as we reached the doorway, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the chamber, freezing me in my tracks. "Leaving so soon?" a voice drawled, its tone dripping with malice. Elliot's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face the source. And there, emerging from the shadows, was a figure I recognized all too well, a face that had haunted the edges of our investigation since the beginning. Dr. Richard Ainsworth stepped forward from the darkness, his figure unnervingly solid in the dim light. He was exactly as he appeared in the old photograph I had found. A tall, gaunt man with a severe face and piercing eyes that seemed to drill into my very core. But there was something else about him, something profoundly unnatural. The air around him seemed to ripple and distort, like the heat haze rising from asphalt on a scorching day. His presence was wrong, a blight that made my skin crawl and my instincts scream. "Elliot Brooks," Ainsworth said, his voice smooth and venomous. He enunciated every syllable with a precision that belied the malice lurking underneath. "I've been expecting you." Elliot's grip on the book tightened, but his expression remained calm, unreadable. "That's quite the introduction," he said, his tone steady. "Though I can't say I'm flattered." Ainsworth let out a low, chilling chuckle that reverberated through the chamber. It wasn't the laugh of a man. It was too deep, too fractured, as if multiple voices were joining him in macabre harmony. "You should be," he replied. "Few have made it this far. Fewer still with their sanity intact." I took an involuntary step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. Ainsworth's gaze flicked toward me, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "And you," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Miguel Vasquez, the chronicler, the observer. You've seen much, haven't you? Learned much. Yet here you stand, a lamb in the lion's den." "Enough," Elliot said sharply. his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. If you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, step aside. Ainsworth's smile widened, his teeth gleaming unnaturally in the faint light. Bold words, he said, his tone dripping with mock admiration. But you misunderstand, Mr. Brooks. I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to guide you. Guide us, I managed, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound composed. Why the sudden generosity? Ainsworth's eyes glittered with something dark and unreadable. Generosity? No, Mr. Vasquez. I am merely a curator of knowledge, a guardian of secrets. What lies beyond this chamber is beyond your comprehension. But I can prepare you. Elliot took a deliberate step forward, his movements careful but unyielding. And what's the price for this guidance of yours? Ainsworth chuckled again, the sound grating against my nerves. Always the skeptic. But no, there is no price. Consider it a parting gift. After all, knowledge is power, is it not? The room seemed to darken as he spoke, the shadows creeping closer, their edges blurring and shifting like living things. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine, my hands gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. Enough games, Elliot said, his voice hardening. What do you want from us? Ainsworth's smile faltered for the briefest moment, replaced by something colder, more calculated. What I want is irrelevant, but what you want lies ahead, past the veil of darkness that even I cannot cross. You seek the truth, Mr. Brooks, and the truth, as they say, will set you free. He extended a hand, his fingers unnaturally long and claw-like, pointing toward the far end of the chamber. There, barely visible in the pulsing light of the symbols, was another doorway, its frame carved with runes that seemed to shift and writhe of their own accord. Elliot hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ainsworth. I could see the gears turning in his mind, weighing the risk, calculating the odds. Finally, he nodded, his grip on the book tightening. Fine, but if this is a trap, Ainsworth's smile returned, colder and sharper than before. It is not a trap, Mr. Brooks. It is an invitation. We approached the doorway cautiously, the weight of Ainsworth's presence still pressing heavily on my chest. The air grew colder with each step, the runes on the doorway glowing brighter as we drew near. I could feel the energy radiating from it, a low, thrumming vibration that set my teeth on edge. Elliot reached the doorway first, his flashlight beam sweeping over the runes. He held the book in his other hand, his expression grim as he studied the symbols. These match the ones in the book, he said, his voice low. This is what Ainsworth was protecting. Great, I muttered, glancing nervously over my shoulder. Ainsworth was still standing in the center of the chamber, watching us with an unsettling intensity. Let's just get this over with. Elliot placed his hand on the doorway, and the runes flared to life, their light blinding and searing. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as a low, guttural hum filled the air. When the light subsided, the doorway was open, revealing a narrow passage lined with what appeared to be mirrors. Their surfaces were dark and reflective, though the images they showed were distorted and warped, as if glimpsed through a cracked lens. What is this? I whispered, stepping closer to one of the mirrors. My reflection stared back at me, but it was wrong. Its movements slightly delayed, its features twisted and grotesque. Some kind of test, Elliot said, his voice tense. Stay close. Don't touch anything. We moved through the passage slowly, our footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The mirrors seemed to close in around us, their distorted reflections flickering with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the reflections weren't just showing us, they were studying us. A sudden noise, like glass shattering, made me whip around, my flashlight beam darting across the mirrors. One of them had cracked, its surface splintered like a spider's web. My reflection stared back at me, its twisted features contorting into a malicious grin before the mirror shattered completely. "Elliot," I said, my voice shaking, "I think we're in trouble." "I know," he replied, his tone grim. "Just keep moving." The passage seemed to stretch endlessly, the mirrors growing darker and more fractured the further we went. The air grew heavier, thicker, making it harder to breathe. My chest ached with every step, my legs trembling as the weight of the asylum pressed down on me. Finally, we reached the end of the passage. Another doorway stood before us, its frame glowing faintly with runes. Beyond it, I could see a faint light, flickering like a distant flame. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice low. "The final step." I nodded, swallowing hard as I braced myself for whatever lay ahead. Together, we stepped through the doorway, leaving behind the mirrors and the distorted reflections. The doorway we stepped through led to something beyond comprehension. It wasn't a room, not in the way the previous chambers had been. It was something far larger, far older, and infinitely more oppressive. The very air felt alive, pulsing with an energy that pressed against my chest and constricted my lungs. The faint, flickering light ahead revealed towering columns stretching impossibly high into the darkness above, their surfaces carved with even more symbols, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as I stared at them. Elliot stepped forward first, his flashlight slicing through the gloom. I stayed close behind, my hands trembling as I gripped my own light. The faint hum that had followed us throughout the asylum had grown into a deep, resonant thrumming, like the heartbeat of some great, slumbering beast. Each pulse seemed to vibrate through my bones, threatening to shake me apart. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the ominous thrum. Elliot didn't answer immediately. His focus was entirely on the altar ahead, a massive stone structure that stood at the very center of the cavernous space. It was unlike the smaller altar we had seen before. This one was grand, almost ceremonial, with intricate carvings covering every inch of its surface. At its center sat a black crystal, jagged and angular, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light. The crystal seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, its presence heavy and foreboding. "This," Elliot said finally, his voice steady but low, "is what Ainsworth was protecting. This is the heart of it all." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I stepped closer. The altar exuded a coldness that cut through the already freezing air, and the symbols carved into its surface seemed to pulse in time with the thrumming. As I drew nearer, I could feel a pull, a faint, almost imperceptible tug in the pit of my stomach, as if the crystal were reaching for me. Elliot raised the book he had taken from the smaller altar, flipping through its pages with practiced efficiency. His flashlight illuminated the ancient text, its symbols matching those carved into the columns and the altar. He muttered under his breath as he read, his brow furrowing in concentration. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "It's a ritual," he replied, his tone clipped. "Ainsworth wasn't just experimenting on his patients. He was trying to harness something beyond." My blood ran cold. "You mean Like a spirit? Not a spirit, Elliot said, shaking his head. Something older. Something that doesn't belong here. He gestured to the crystal at the center of the altar. That's the key. It's the anchor. I stared at the crystal, dread pooling in my stomach. Anchor for what? Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the book, his eyes scanning the text with even greater urgency. The thrumming grew louder, more insistent, the vibrations making the ground beneath us tremble. The symbols carved into the columns flared brighter, casting eerie, shifting patterns across the chamber walls. And then the shadows returned. They poured out from the darkness, coalescing into twisted, amorphous forms that writhed and pulsed with malevolence. Their movements were erratic, their forms flickering like flames caught in a violent wind. They didn't hesitate this time, didn't linger or taunt. They lunged. "Elliot!" I shouted, raising my flashlight and sweeping it toward the nearest shadow. The beam cut through it like a blade, causing the shadow to recoil with a deafening screech. It twisted and thrashed before dissipating into the air, but more took its place, surging forward with relentless fury. "Keep them back," Elliot barked, his voice sharp as he flipped to another page of the book. "I need time." Time. It was the one thing we didn't have. The shadows were everywhere, their numbers overwhelming, their forms shifting and multiplying faster than we could repel them. I swung my flashlight in wild, desperate arcs, the beam flickering with every frantic movement. Each burst of light drove the shadows back momentarily, but it wasn't enough. They were relentless. One of the shadows darted past my guard, its tendrils lashing out and wrapping around my arm. The cold was excruciating, a searing, bone-deep chill that made me cry out in pain. I swung the flashlight at it with all my strength, the beam cutting through the tendrils and forcing the shadow to retreat, but the damage was done. My arm felt numb, heavy, as though the very life had been drained from it. Elliot remained focused on the book, his voice rising as he began to recite the words scrawled across its pages. The language was unfamiliar, guttural, and harsh, each syllable resonating with an unnatural power. The shadows faltered at the sound, their movements growing slower, more hesitant. But they didn't stop. The thrumming grew louder still, the vibrations so intense now that the very air seemed to hum with energy. The crystal on the altar pulsed in time with the sound, its surface glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. I could feel the pull again, stronger this time, almost dragging me toward it. "What are you doing?" I shouted over the din, my voice raw with fear. "Severing the anchor," Elliot replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "If we don't, this thing, whatever it is, will break free." Another shadow lunged at me, its movements faster and more aggressive than the others. I swung my flashlight desperately, the beam slicing through its form and causing it to dissolve into smoke. My chest heaved with the effort, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Hurry," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't keep this up much longer." Elliot didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the book, his voice rising as he chanted the incantation. The symbols carved into the altar flared brighter with each word, their light pulsing in time with the crystal. The shadows seemed to falter, their forms wavering, but they didn't retreat. If anything, they became more desperate, more frenzied. The crystal pulsed one last time, brighter than ever, before shattering with a deafening crack. The sound reverberated through the chamber, drowning out even the thrumming. The shadows froze, their forms flickering and unstable, before they began to dissolve, their anguished screams echoing as they were pulled back into the darkness. And then silence. The chamber was still, the oppressive weight that had hung over us lifting like a fog dissipating. I fell to my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. My flashlight clattered to the ground beside me, its beam casting a faint glow on the now dormant altar. Elliot stood over the shattered remains of the crystal, the book still clutched tightly in his hands. His expression was grim, his eyes dark as he stared down at the altar. The faint light illuminated his face, casting sharp shadows that made him look older, wearier. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He closed the book with a deliberate motion, slipping it into his coat before turning to face me. "For now," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I let out a shaky breath, my head falling into my hands as I tried to steady myself. The reality of what we had just faced was almost too much to process. The shadows, the crystal, the sheer malevolence of the presence that had filled the chamber. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered, and I hoped, desperately, that I would never encounter it again. Elliot extended a hand, pulling me to my feet. His grip was firm, reassuring, despite the exhaustion etched into his features. "Come on," he said. "We're not done yet." I nodded, though my legs felt like lead as I followed him toward the doorway. The symbols on the columns had dimmed, their light fading into nothingness as the energy in the chamber dissipated. The thrumming was gone, replaced by an almost eerie silence. As we stepped through the doorway and back into the passage, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching us. I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see Ainsworth standing in the shadows, his piercing gaze fixed on us. But the chamber was empty, and yet the weight of his presence lingered. Elliot's pace quickened as we left the heart of the chamber behind, the oppressive weight of the place still clawing at my back like unseen hands. My legs moved instinctively to match his strides, but my mind lagged, replaying the chilling laughter and those shadows that felt too close, too real. The runes along the corridor dimmed as we passed them, their light fading into the dark stones like dying embers. My flashlight flickered again, just a brief stutter, but it was enough to jolt my already fragile nerves. "This place doesn't want us here," I muttered under my breath, though it wasn't meant for Elliot. It was the kind of thought you said out loud to ground yourself, to stave off the growing panic gnawing at the edges of your mind. Elliot didn't answer. He rarely did when his mind was focused on the task ahead. His flashlight beam swept purposefully across the floor, the walls, the ceiling, searching for something, anything that might give us a clue. His grip on the leather-bound book was tight, his knuckles pale under the strain. We reached a junction where the corridor split into two narrow paths. Both stretched out into the darkness, their destinations obscured by the shadows that clung to them like a shroud. Elliot stopped, his gaze darting between the two paths as if weighing some unseen options. "What do you think?" I asked, my voice barely audible in the stifling silence. He tilted his head slightly, listening. It was a habit of his, waiting for the subtle, the overlooked. After a moment, he pointed to the left-hand passage. "This way. Not going to tell me how you decided that, are you?" I said, trying to inject some levity into the situation, though the fear gripping my chest made my attempt fall flat. "There's a draft coming from the left," he said simply. "Airflow means an exit, or at least another chamber." I followed him into the left-hand passage, my flashlight barely illuminating the narrow, uneven floor. The walls here were closer, the stones cracked and damp, and the air had a musty, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. It was colder, too, much colder. My breath came out in faint white wisps, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, though it did little to ward off the chill. The passage sloped downward, the incline gradual but unmistakable. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became, pressing down on us with an almost physical weight. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, each beat a sharp reminder of how alive I was, and how close that could come to changing. "What if we don't find anything down here?" I asked, my voice strained. The silence had stretched too long, and I needed to fill it with something, anything, to keep the crushing darkness at bay. "We'll find something," Elliot replied, his voice steady. Ainsworth wouldn't have gone to these lengths to hide something worthless. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was enough to keep me moving. The man had an uncanny ability to make you believe in his certainty, even when everything around you screamed otherwise. The passage leveled out, and we emerged into another chamber. This one was smaller, more enclosed, but no less unsettling. The walls were lined with shelves, each one stacked with glass jars filled with murky, discolored liquids. The contents of the jars were obscured by the grime clinging to the glass, but the faint outlines of shapes, twisted, grotesque shapes, sent a wave of nausea rolling through me. "Specimens," Elliot said, his voice devoid of emotion. He was collecting them. For what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He didn't respond, his focus shifting to a large, rusted metal door at the far end of the chamber. It was bolted shut with thick iron bars, and the faint, rhythmic sound of something tapping against the other side made my blood run cold. "Elliot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "do we really want to open that?" He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "We don't have a choice." He moved to the door, his flashlight beam sweeping over the bolts as he inspected them. They were old, corroded, but still sturdy. He set the book down on a nearby shelf and pulled a small crowbar from his coat, an item I hadn't even known he was carrying. With a grunt of effort, he pried at the bolts, the metal screeching in protest as they gave way one by one. I stood back, my flashlight trained on the door, my hands trembling. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through the floor and up into my legs. My stomach churned, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But I couldn't leave Elliot. So I stayed, rooted to the spot, waiting for whatever horror lay on the other side of that door. The final bolt gave way with a sharp crack, and Elliot stepped back, his breathing steady despite the effort. He reached for the door handle, pausing for just a moment before pulling it open. What lay beyond defied all logic. The room was vast, impossibly so, its size far exceeding the physical boundaries of the asylum. The walls were carved with the same symbols we had seen throughout the structure, their light pulsing like the slow, steady beat of a heart. In the center of the room stood a massive, circular stone platform, its surface inscribed with intricate runes that seemed to shift and change when I tried to focus on them. Suspended above the platform was a sphere of dark, swirling energy, its surface crackling with arcs of crimson lightning. The air around it rippled and distorted, pulling at the edges of reality like a black hole threatening to consume everything in its path. Elliot stepped forward, his flashlight beam fixed on the sphere. I hesitated, my feet refusing to move as I stared at the thing in open-mouthed horror. "This is it," he said, his voice low but firm. This is what Ainsworth was trying to control. What is it? I asked, my voice trembling. And how do we stop it? Elliot didn't answer immediately. He moved to the platform, his flashlight illuminating the runes as he carefully examined them. It's a containment field, he said finally. Ainsworth wasn't just experimenting. He was trying to summon something, and when he couldn't control it, he trapped it here. And now what? I asked, my throat dry. Do we leave it? Do we destroy it? Before Elliot could answer, the sphere pulsed, sending a wave of energy rippling through the room. The force knocked me off my feet, my flashlight skittering across the floor. The runes on the platform flared brighter, their light almost blinding as the sphere began to expand, its surface writhing like a living thing. Elliot shouted something, his voice lost in the chaos as the energy in the room reached a deafening crescendo. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes fixed on him as he opened the book, his lips moving as he recited the words scrawled across its pages. The sphere roared in response, its energy lashing out in violent arcs that struck the walls and sent shards of stone raining down around us. I shielded my head with my arms, my heart pounding as Elliot continued his chant, his voice rising above the chaos. The room trembled, the ground beneath us shaking violently as the sphere writhed and thrashed against its containment. I could feel the energy pulling at me, tugging at my very soul, and I fought to hold my ground, to keep myself from being dragged into the swirling abyss. And then, with a final, ear-splitting crack, the sphere collapsed in on itself, its energy imploding into a single blinding point of light. The force of the collapse sent me sprawling to the floor, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. When the light faded, the room was silent once more. The platform was dark, its runes extinguished, and the sphere was gone. Elliot stood at its edge, the book still clutched tightly in his hands, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. It's done, he said, his voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. I nodded weakly, my body trembling as I pushed myself to my feet. The weight of what we had just faced, what we had just stopped, settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I knew, deep in my bones, that nothing would ever be the same. The silence after the collapse of the sphere was so profound it felt unnatural, like the world had momentarily ceased its eternal hum of existence. My ears rang faintly, the only testament to the chaos that had just unfolded. I leaned against the cold stone wall of the chamber, every inch of my body trembling with exhaustion. My legs felt like water, ready to give out beneath me, and the flashlight in my hand was a dead weight, its once reassuring glow reduced to a faint flicker. Elliot stood motionless near the remains of the altar, his back to me as he stared at the darkened runes. The leather-bound book was still clutched in his hand, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze created by the aftermath. Whatever had been contained in that crystal was gone now, or at least that's what I wanted to believe. My gut told me otherwise, that the echoes of its presence still lingered, like the residual static of a powerful storm. I forced myself to stand upright, my flashlight beam casting long, jagged shadows across the fractured ground. Elliot, I croaked, my voice hoarse and raw from shouting. We need to get out of here. He didn't respond immediately. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid, as though he were bracing himself for some unseen force. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was unreadable, calm, but not at ease. The flickering light danced across his features, casting deep shadows under his eyes, and I couldn't tell if the weariness I saw there was physical or something deeper. "We're not finished yet," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil we'd just endured. "Not finished," I repeated, incredulous. "Elliot, that thing, it's gone. The crystal shattered. What more is there?" He held up the book, its worn leather cover seeming to pulse faintly in the dim light. "There's still more to understand. This book isn't just a record of what Ainsworth did. It's a map, a blueprint of the asylum and the horrors he unleashed here. If we leave now, we're only delaying the inevitable." I wanted to argue, to tell him that we'd done enough, that we'd faced enough. But deep down, I knew he was right. The asylum wasn't just a place. It was a wound, festering and bleeding into the world. Until that wound was closed, it would continue to infect everything it touched. With a resigned sigh, I nodded. "Fine, but let's make it quick. I don't think this place is going to give us a warm send-off." Elliot gave me one of his rare, fleeting smiles, a ghost of an expression that disappeared as quickly as it came. He turned back toward the altar, his flashlight beam sweeping over the darkened runes. "There's another passage," he said, pointing to a narrow archway on the far side of the chamber. "The book mentions a hidden vault. That's where we'll find the answers." The passage was narrow and winding, its walls rough and uneven, as though it had been carved in haste rather than designed with any real purpose. The air grew colder with each step, the faint metallic tang returning and clinging to the back of my throat. My flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows that danced along the jagged walls. I tightened my grip on it, willing the damn thing not to fail me. Elliot moved ahead, his pace steady and unyielding. His flashlight illuminated fragments of writing carved into the walls, cryptic symbols and phrases in a language I didn't recognize. Some of the carvings were deep and deliberate, while others were haphazard, as though made by a trembling hand in a moment of desperation. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at me since we entered the asylum grew stronger, the weight of the place pressing down on me like a physical force. We reached a dead end, or at least what appeared to be one. The passage terminated in a solid stone wall, its surface smooth and unmarked compared to the jagged surroundings. Elliot didn't hesitate. He opened the book, flipping through its pages until he found what he was looking for. He traced a finger along the text, his lips moving silently as he read. "This is it," he said finally, stepping closer to the wall. "The vault." I frowned, glancing at the featureless stone. "It doesn't look like much of a vault to me." "It's sealed," Elliot explained, his tone patient but distracted. "Ainsworth used a ritual to lock it. The symbols on the wall will reveal the entrance once the incantation is spoken." The thought of invoking yet another ritual in this cursed place made my stomach churn, but I knew better than to argue. Elliot had a way of being right about these things, even when I desperately wished he wasn't. He began to recite the incantation, his voice low and deliberate. The words felt wrong, heavy, and jagged, as though they weren't meant to be spoken by human tongues. As he spoke, the air in the passage grew colder, and the faint hum I'd been hearing since we entered the asylum returned, louder and more resonant. The symbols on the wall began to glow faintly, their edges shimmering like the surface of a disturbed pond. The stone wall shuddered, a deep, grinding noise reverberating through the passage as it slowly slid aside to reveal a dark, yawning void beyond. A rush of freezing air spilled out, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. I shivered, the cold seeping into my bones despite the layers of clothing I wore. "After you," I muttered, gesturing for Elliot to take the lead. He gave me a wry look before stepping through the threshold, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. I followed reluctantly, my steps hesitant as the oppressive weight of the place settled over me once more. The vault was massive, its walls lined with shelves that stretched high into the darkness above. The shelves were filled with objects, artifacts, jars, books, and trinkets that radiated a faint, malevolent energy. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface inscribed with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Resting atop the pedestal was a small, ornate box, its surface covered in intricate carvings. "This is what he was protecting," Elliot said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and trepidation. He approached the pedestal slowly, his flashlight sweeping over the box. "This is the source of it all. What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Another anchor?" "Not exactly," Elliot replied. "It's a conduit. Ainsworth wasn't just trying to summon something. He was trying to bind it to this world. This box is the key." The thought of opening the box filled me with dread, but I knew Elliot wouldn't leave without answers. He reached for it cautiously, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. As his fingers brushed the surface, the runes on the pedestal flared to life, their glow intensifying until the room was bathed in an otherworldly light. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the vault, its tone resonant and filled with malice. The walls seemed to tremble with the force of it, the shelves rattling as though the room itself were alive. "You dare disturb my sanctuary?" the voice growled, each word laced with venom. "You, who know nothing of the forces you meddle with?" Elliot didn't flinch, his grip on the box tightening. "We're here to end this," he said firmly. "Whatever Ainsworth unleashed, it ends now." The voice laughed, a deep, chilling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Fools," it said, "you cannot end what has already begun. The cycle is eternal, and you are but dust in the wind." The runes on the pedestal flared again, and the ground beneath us began to shake violently. Elliot opened the box, revealing a small, glowing crystal that pulsed with an otherworldly light. The voice roared in fury, its presence filling the room as shadows began to coalesce around us. "Destroy it," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. Elliot didn't hesitate. He raised the crystal above his head, then brought it down with all his strength against the edge of the pedestal. The crystal shattered, its light exploding outward in a blinding wave that consumed everything. For a moment, there was nothing but light, pure, blinding light, and then darkness. When I opened my eyes, the vault was silent. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Elliot stood beside me, his breathing heavy, the remains of the box and the crystal scattered at his feet. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. I nodded, though my body felt heavy and numb. We had stopped whatever Ainsworth had started, but the cost of it lingered in the air around us, a haunting reminder of the darkness we had faced. Without another word, we turned and made our way back through the asylum, the weight of our actions pressing heavily on our shoulders. The echoes of the abyss followed us, silent but never truly gone.